All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Mark Twain House's Trouble Begins with Matt Seybold for his lecture on Percival Everett's James. You may be used to seeing Jody or Mallory here. I am here in their stead. I'm Erin Bartram, Associate Director for Education at the Mark Twain House. We are so excited to host you this evening, so many of you for this event. And so thank you for joining us from your own homes. As usual, tell us where you're joining from. Any Elmira folks there other than Matt? As a reminder, a replay of the event will be made available on the Trouble Begins playlist of our YouTube channel. I will drop the link in the chat as we go, and you can also find it on our website. At the end of the program, we will take a few minutes to answer some questions from the audience. We're kind of going to do it in two stages. So those of you who haven't finished the book or haven't read the book fully, will sort of towards the very end ask you to leave if you want to avoid spoilers, and then we'll take some sort of spoilery questions. Those of you who have finished the book probably know what kind of spoilers we are talking about here. Before we get started, I'd like to thank our sponsors for the 2024 Trouble Begins season, Kathleen and David Jimenez. We still have one more Trouble Begins, which I believe is next week, so join us for that. And I will introduce our guest, who may be familiar to many of you. Matt Seybold is Associate Professor of American Literature and Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College, as well as Resident Scholar at the Center for Mark Twain Studies. He is also the founding director of the Media Studies Communication and Design program at Elmira College, executive producer and host of the American Vandal podcast, and founding editor of marktwainstudies.org. He is co-editor of the Routledge Companion to Literature and Economics and a 2019 special issue of American Literary History on Economics and Literary Studies in the New Gilded Age. His work has appeared in dozens of publications. He's been a long friend of the Mark Twain House, and we are so excited to have him here tonight to talk about James. So thank you very much, Matt.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you to the Mark Twain House and Museum, where I have had the good pleasure of coming and consulting and speaking, and it's just always great to work with everybody there. So I'm pleased to be back, even in this virtual form. I built my remarks today very much around the Percival Everett visit to Hartford last week. If you were not there, I still think you'll be able, or haven't watched the video, I still think you'll be able to follow along. But for those who were there and who had the experience of seeing him talk about this new novel in Hartford, I wanted to sort of build off of some of the things he said. So the way I'm going to structure it today is I've got sort of three key remarks that he made that I want to work with, and then I will sort of open it up to Q&A. And as Erin said, maybe after one wave of Q&A, we can move back to the question of the ending. And those who haven't completed the book and don't want any spoilers can log off at that point. And we can, focus in on some of the big questions that are introduced at the end. But I'll start by saying that one of the things that stood out to me about Percival Everett's conversation with Michael Harriot last week was the way he talked about his method. I'd heard him say in other interviews that he read Adventures of Huckleberry Finn over a dozen times before writing James. But I hadn't heard him describe as clearly why he did that. He told Michael that he wanted to intuitively inhabit the world, but for the source text to become a blur. So he was never worrying about crafting direct concordances between Twain's plot and his own. For those of us who have read Huckleberry Finn at least as many times as Everett did, it's easy to point out these divergences even before the plot takes its dramatic U-turn in the latter third or so of the book. But it doesn't matter, because what he does masterfully is recreate that world. This is what I wrote in my pre-publication review of the novel for Cleveland Review of Books before I had heard Everett talk about this process. No other adaptation or sequel, including those written by Twain himself, has succeeded in transporting me back to this world, made me linger there anew and afresh, see it again through other eyes, nor, by far the most impressive accomplishment, rendered it in an equally compelling voice. I'm going to talk about some of the critical interpretations of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn today, as I did in that review, and I think it's reasonable to presume that Everett treated them in much the same way he treated the novel itself. At some point, he read them or encountered them. He has, after all, spent more than 40 years attending and then working for universities. Uh, he has inhabited the world of U.S. literary criticism in which Huckleberry Finn has long been a hypercanonical text. And Doubleday itself, in its promotions for James, calls Huck Finn the canonical American novel. But I don't necessarily think that while Everett was composing James, he was like running to his bookshelf or his computer to check his sources in Twain Studies. But much like a Twain scholar, he's been so immersed in writing by and about Twain for so long that the panoply of interpretations has almost become second nature. And Everett can and does engage them as it suits his narrative purposes. And we'll talk about some examples of that today. The one that I use in my review, which I can really quickly summarize here, is that Jane Smiley, in a Harper's essay from 1996, asserted that neither Huck nor Twain take Jim's desire for freedom at all seriously because they never even account for their choice to go down the river rather than across it. Smiley thinks, hey, Illinois is a free state. It's right there on the opposite side of the river. Swim across, problem solved. Other critics have disputed both the claim that Twain never accounts for this choice. For instance, bounty hunters intercept Huck from the Illinois side of the river, or they historicize Jim's focus on the juncture of the Ohio and the Mississippi at Cairo, which Jim reasonably believes to be the fastest route to genuine abolitionist strongholds. But Everett takes this minor critical controversy in Twain Studies, and he makes a whole plot line out of it. James repeatedly finds himself on the Illinois side of the Mississippi River in Everett's narrative. And early on, he asks another black man, Old George, so I'm in a free state. And the ensuing zinger is, boy, you're in America. And it's then followed by a fuller explanation. We're in Illinois, true enough, Old George says, and Illinois is supposed to be a free state, true enough, but the white folks around here tell us we're in Tennessee. And another enslaved man, Josiah, adds, what are we going to do? Take a map to the courts and say, look here, we're actually free? This epiphany permanently alters James's worldview in Everett's novel. He says, free state, slave state, ain't no difference one side to the other. This is a major insight into how enslavement functions in antebellum America, one which I think Twain might have taken to some extent for granted, but which contemporary readers need to reckon with. As long as enslavement exists anywhere, jurisdiction is just a fable. The law itself is merely an illusion, to be sustained by communities of enslavers at their whim or lifted in favor of lashing and lynching. And this is a lesson we can pretty easily translate into contemporary terms. If you make a person legally less than anywhere, if you take away their rights anywhere, that compromised status travels with them everywhere, endangers them everywhere. Another thing Everett mentioned during the conversation last week was how much of the achievement of Twain's novel is in the construction of his character narrator. As readers, we're prisoners of Huckleberry Finn's fascinating perspective and voice. Character narrators were a relative rarity in 19th century American fiction. So that in and of itself, it's something which sets this novel apart. But Huck is actually something even more rare across the whole span of literary history, which is a character narrator whose character status precedes his narrator status. That is, Twain invents Huckleberry Finn as a sidekick whose perspective we have almost no access to in Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And then he converts him into a narrator who provides the only perspective upon the events in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. So we move from Huck being characterized to Huck doing the characterization. We move from Huck being objectified to Huck doing the objectification. Whether or not you have read the prequel to Huckleberry Finn, whether or not you've read Tom Sawyer, the character has been established under very different formal conditions, which Twain is then adapting to his new work. But he's presumably trying to retain some continuity between those works. He even makes reference to that in the very opening lines of the novel. And as I said, this is an exceedingly rare phenomena in the history of the novel. I bet not even one novel out of every 100. And it suggests a kind of operation of radical sympathy for both the author and the reader, as we have to sort of be ported in and sutured into the interior of a character who already exists elsewhere as pure exterior. It's no small achievement to pull this off. And I think Adventures of Huckleberry Finn is, in fact, a kind of victim of its own success in this respect. That is, Huck is such a compelling, immersive, and sympathetic narrator that many readers are inclined to identify with him, to idolize him, and even to regard him as they might an omniscient narrator in a romantic novel, who is, particularly in the 19th century tradition, dictating the moral laws which govern the world into which we are entering. Because Twain is so successful in producing Huck's unique narrative voice, I think some readers forget that to Twain and to some other readers, Huck is still the same deeply flawed and, more importantly, deeply precarious and powerless child who we first met in Adventures of Tom Sawyer. There is nothing about Huck in that first novel that would make you think he was going to do anything but what he does and what many readers object to in the final chapters of the story Twain tells. Huck falls in line. He accepts his powerlessness. He accepts Jim's dehumanization. He protects foremost his own neck. And he wishes things were otherwise, but cannot conceive of himself doing anything to make it so. The wishful thinking of the all right, then I'll go to hell speech gives us access to the psyche of somebody who is in the process of recognizing the cruelty and injustice of the systems and structures in which he lives, but who is utterly unprepared, ill-positioned, and incompetent to do anything about it. I think that's some real shit. And if you've fallen in love with Huck and you're waiting for the catharsis of his becoming the conquering hero in the final scenes, it hurts. And some readers and critics get mad about it and they call it a failure. But that's the point. Nothing about what happens in those final 12 chapters is supposed to make you feel good about Huck or about Tom or about the Phelpses or about America. More on that momentarily. But let's get back to James. One reason I appreciated Everett talking about the limitation Twain created for himself when he converted Huck to a character narrator is that, yeah, obviously he's thought a lot about that limitation because he's undertaking the exact same thing. He's taking Jim, who has only ever been a character in somebody else's story, whose perspective we only get access to through the relatively few moments when Huck, and only Huck, takes an interest in his perspective, and he's turning him into the lens through which we view the entirety of this pre-existing world. The world that Everett learned to inhabit by reading Adventures of Huckleberry Finn 15 times in succession. As much as any plot point or thematic continuity between Huckleberry Finn and James, it's that formal operation of radical sympathy that connects these novels. Jim has all this cultural baggage, not just from his depiction in Twain's novels, but from the way he's been interpreted and adapted and archetyped during the ensuing 140 years. To climb inside and construct a consciousness, an interior beneath all that baggage, is a tremendous risk and a tremendous accomplishment. And it changes the way we perceive a world, quite literally. Not least of all, by throwing Huck back out of the driver's seat and into the supporting cast. He reminds us, that is, Everett reminds us or requires us to see Huck, not be Huck. And I personally think, and perhaps hope, this is going to have a profound impact on how people think about Twain's novel going forward. Everett leaves no room for Hemingway's heroic Huck, the Huck wished for by those that stop reading after he says, "All right, then I'll go to hell." Now we have these three conflicting perspectives: Twain's, or more accurately, maybe Twain mixed with Tom from Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Huck's from his novel, and James's. And the reconciliation of these three is a kind of hermeneutic challenge, which I think has few analogs in literary history. Obviously, we are only a few months from the publication of James, but I really believe James and Huck are going to become indivisible from one another. For Twain's novel to retain its hypercanonical status, it's going to have to fuse with Everett's. And I really think it's going to be all the better for it. All right. The third thing Everett said last week that really stood out to me is that he thought we could keep teaching Huckleberry Finn because of what he described as a new interpretation of the novel as an allegory of Reconstruction. First of all, this is not an entirely new interpretation. There are some rather crude versions of it circulating as early as the mid-1970s, and Shelley Fishkin and Bob Lamb and Larry Howe have all added weight and merit to various forms of this interpretation, as I hope have I. And I'm going to give you my version through two paratexts. The first is a Frederick Douglass speech, Lessons of Emancipation to the Next Generation, given on the occasion of an Emancipation Day celebration here in Elmira in 1880. A couple of years ago, I reconstructed this speech and we published it on the Center for Mark Twain Studies website. And prior to that, it only existed in excerpts and partial manuscripts spread across several different archives. The speech is fascinating as a primary text unto itself, but that's not exactly what I'm concerned with today. We have strong circumstantial evidence that Mark Twain was in attendance for this speech. If you want to review that evidence in full, I have documented the full arc of the Douglas-Twain relationship at the Center for Mark Twain Studies website, including digitizing our archival documents from Elmira, Berkeley, the Library of Congress, and our gracious host today, the Mark Twain House Museum. But in summation, the Clemens family was in Elmira when Douglas's speech took place. Both Sam and, more importantly, his wife's family, the Langdons, had existing friendships with Douglas. And in fact, Douglas made a point of visiting a memorial to Jervis Langdon, Twain's father-in-law, who had been a station master on the Underground Railroad while he was in town for his speech. The Langdons harbored Douglas during his first flight to freedom 40 years earlier. Among the things Douglas discusses in the Lessons of Emancipation is the failure of Reconstruction, specifically the development of the sharecropping system, which he regards explicitly as a condition but little above enslavement. In part of Douglas's speech, he stumps for the Republican presidential ticket, just as Twain had also done during the 1880 campaign season. But elsewhere, Douglas excoriates the Republican Party for abandoning Reconstruction, allowing the 14th and 15th Amendments to be virtually nullified. Those are his words, and selling out emancipated people for the maintenance of thin partisan majorities. Douglas remarks on the rise of the Ku Klux Klan, the prevalence of lynching in the South, and the erosion of voting rights. Twain does three conspicuous things in the days immediately following Douglas's speech in Elmira. One, he stops working on his sequel to The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, which he'd been drafting pretty steadily during his summer residency at Quarry Farm leading up to Douglas's speech. Second, he books his first trip below the Mason-Dixon line since he fled Missouri at the outset of the Civil War in 1861. And third, he writes a few things in his journal which seem likely to have been inspired by Douglas's speech. Foremost among them, the one that I'll quote now, "There is hardly a single celebrated Southern name in any of the departments of human industry, except those of war, murder, assassination, lynching, the duel, repudiation, and massacre." Twain adds, "There is not a living Southern celebrity in art today, nor science." So Twain, who calls himself a reconstructed Southerner, expresses his intense anger with the unreconstructed South, but also refigures that anger as self-hatred. And I posit in all the crossing out and revising that he does in this journal entry, which was never published anywhere else, we see him struggling to fully reconcile himself to Douglas's speech and the account Douglas gives of the failure of Reconstruction. To accept it, he needs to go see it for himself. And that's exactly what he does. He goes back to the Mississippi River and he spends months going up and down it under the auspices of revising his memoir of steamboat piloting, what will become Life on the Mississippi. But when he returns to Elmira, he takes up Adventures of Huckleberry Finn again. And it becomes a very different kind of book, a simulation, as Toni Morrison calls it, of the failure of Reconstruction. He wants his readers to feel what he felt, listening to Douglas, returning to the South, and finding it more or less unchanged by decades of bloodshed and occupation and alleged reform. Twain was personally traumatized by the Civil War, as many were. But the payoff, he had convinced himself by the 1880s, was emancipation, enfranchisement, and equality. But that didn't happen. No enlightenment, no epiphany, no escape, no end. And his novel can't have those things either. The other paratext, which underwrites my allegorical reading of Huckleberry Finn, comes from Life on the Mississippi, in which Twain repeatedly makes the seemingly hyperbolic claim that he holds Walter Scott responsible for the Civil War. It's a wild proposition, he admits. He also admits that by Walter Scott, he kind of means romanticism and sentimentality and Anglophilia and florid chivalry and sham Christianity and patriarchy and women. But mainly he means Walter Scott. And he even goes so far as to posit that as much as the Civil War was about slavery, it might have been avoided had it not been for Walter Scott. These are Twain's words: "Enough is laid on slavery without fathering upon it these creations and contributions of Walter Scott." Now, here, of course, is the bane of being a Twain scholar. Twain's writing, both public and private, is so layered with irony, hyperbole, what Bob Lamb calls double voicing, that it is frequently hard to know whether he means a thing or its opposite, or possibly both at once. But if we take Twain literally, that among the two greatest evils of the antebellum South, one is its addiction to Scott's novels, what he calls the Walter Scott disease. I think that's very clarifying for Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. The first thing Twain wrote upon resuming work on the novel after his return from the South was the Shepherdson and Grangerford feud, an episode of plantation feudalism in which two ostentatious families slaughter each other in the name of an extra-legal chivalric code, which no one knows the origins of and which is utterly incomprehensible to outsiders. The Grangerfords, who Huck lives with for an indeterminable period of time, possess the wealth and property of the English gentry, and they fabricate titles and rituals in lowbrow imitation of nobility, like what they would have seen in Walter Scott's novels. The feud ends, of course, with Huck dragging the corpse of his doppelganger, a tween named Buck Grangerford, from the river after witnessing him get gunned down in a mass shooting incited by the alleged dishonoring of a damsel, who Huck alone knows to be in a star-crossed, consensual love affair. What would seem at the beginning to be a burlesquing of the Hatfields and McCoys becomes this launch pad for American realism, as we witness the material violence wrought by incoherent ideology through the eyes of a traumatized child. Conditioned to idolize the plantation aristocracy, from this point forward, Huck is in a constant process of disillusionment with romanticism, with capitalism, with liberalism, with democracy, with law and order, with Christianity, and with white supremacy. And once inoculated by trauma against the Walter Scott disease, nearly everything about Southern society ceases to make sense to him. And he sees the ghastliness, cruelty, and violence everywhere. The American romantic imagination is supposed to die in that tree in Tennessee, alongside Buck Grangerford, as is the Walter Scott disease, but it doesn't, which is what makes it so disorienting for us as readers when in the final 12 chapters, Tom Sawyer returns to literally play act plot lines from Walter Scott's novel at Jim's expense. And Huck does nothing to stop him. Instead, he just resumes his place as Tom's sycophantic sidekick. So the personification of pulpy adventure tries to reanimate the corpse of romanticism, parades it around, Weekend at Bernie's style, a macabre puppet in full view of the gawking public. And Twain's hope, I think, was that once we got this whiff of zombie Walter Scott, there would be no doubt. Romance is dead, and Tom Sawyer deserves a dose of lead as well. But many readers just held their nose and closed their eyes. The end of Reconstruction, the rise of the New South, these are romantic illusions, and not even particularly well-crafted ones. They can only hold up for people who never go looking to see for themselves. What Twain sees when he goes to look at the charade, this amateur burlesque, this theater of emancipation, which has none of the catharsis of real freedom. And that's the kind of ending he has to give Huck as well. Which brings us back to Everett again. James also ends with 12 chapters that are, I would say, a departure from the rest of the novel. Whereas Twain withholds catharsis, Everett gives it to us in excess, almost too much of it, heaping Tarantino-sized scoops of catharsis. It's a kind of mirror, a kind of inversion of Twain's approach, one which I'm still trying to wrap my head around. But also, I don't want to talk too much about the end just yet. So I'm going to stop here and open up for questions, excluding, right, one type of question, which we don't want to talk about quite yet, which is the twist that Everett gives us at the end of James. Uh, but other than that,
Yeah, folks, if you have questions, put them in the Q&A box because they'll go by too quickly in the chat. Um, and we'll do a little bit of this conversation. If you have finished the book, don't drop spoilers in the chat. Well, and to give everyone time to come up with their question and put it into words, I'll throw a few out there. I wonder if you can talk a bit about the way, because I kind of agree, like I think everyone at the museum who has read James and those of us who teach Huck Finn, it seems impossible to think of one without the other now. And I
mhm.
wonder if you can talk a bit about how Everett's take on language in this novel might help us think differently about Huck Finn.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I mean, I didn't necessarily talk about it today, but it's central to the review I wrote for Cleveland Review of Books. And I do think it's, in some ways, it's the most ingenious thing that Everett does, which is, again, one of the things that makes Huckleberry Finn such an astounding success is the way that Twain succeeds in capturing this range of voices, these dialects from various parts of the South and various peoples of the South, including Black people. And I think one of the challenges that faced Everett or faces anybody who wants to take up a kind of adaptation of Twain's novel is that none of us, black or white, regardless of our background, at this point in history, has spent as much time listening to enslaved people talk as Twain had. Okay? Twain, that had been a huge part of his childhood. Right? His fascination with voices and with a diversity of voices goes all the way back to his early youth and continues, right, into his adulthood. And we have lots of examples in Hartford, in Elmira, and elsewhere of him seeking out people from different parts of the country, from different demographics, and certainly specifically people who had experienced enslavement. Right? And so he has this capacity for reproducing those voices that even Everett, no matter what amount of research or insight, or certainly Black experience he might have, he he can't realistically expect himself to hear the voices the way Twain does, right? But the great insight that he has is that Twain wasn't going to hear how Black people talked when he wasn't around. Right? And this recognition that he talked about during his, during the Q&A last week, that there are always, right, this kind of code switching, hush harbors, right, sort of linguistic differences that are designed to create safety, right? And to create shared community and identity in situations of exploitation, right? And then he's able to sort of use that recognition, a very thoroughly historicized fact, right, to then invent this language that Twain would not have access to, that Huck would not have access to, and then open up this whole new world that we don't get to see in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, right? And it's a world that is, a world that is created by language and, to a lesser extent, by literature, by literacy, maybe more accurately, right? And this is like many narratives of enslavement and emancipation from the 19th century written by Black authors. This is a book about the way liberation is encoded in literacy and language. And that I think is maybe the most ingenious part of it. And it also, I think, reveals the way that Twain's book is kind of about that too, right? That about the range of different voices that can be encountered in early America and about raising some of those voices, right? And legitimizing them and liberating them. And I think that's one of the most ingenious things about whatever it has done.
And that actually gets to one of the questions in the Q&A, Tim asking about his thought that a major subject of James is code switching specifically. Yeah. Um, let's see. We've got a few that have come in different places here. So Tom says he'd always told his students that Twain hated Walter Scott, and that's why he named the stranded boat that. Is this where he's picking this up again? And I think yes, you have confirmed.
Yeah.
Um, uh, uh, maybe the not the most subtle metaphor.
Yeah.
So Charlie has said, I'm surprised you've talked about both books and never mentioned their experiences on the river. No specific question in there, but I'm not sure if there's a river thing you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly the kind of, idol of the river, the naturalistic uh, symbolism of the river is something that critics have made a great deal about. Mm. But I would actually say in both books, the amount of narrative time, not temporal time, right? But narrative time that is spent on the river is actually relatively small, right? That the action of the book takes place on land, right? When Huck and James have to re-enter society and often encounter all sorts of, violence and hatred and debauchery and fraud, right? The moment they put their feet on the banks, danger abounds, right? And so while we do have these wonderful passages, particularly in Twain's novel, about the kind of idle time that they spend between being forced back to land, right? The actual description of events that take place on the river is relatively small compared to the plot is moved forward whenever they leave the river or are forced to leave the river.
Yeah. We have a question here. Why does Everett utilize a minstrel style group to enlighten James in such a unique way? The double disguises of James and another black man hiding as black men was so interesting.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I also found that section and those passages fascinating, and particularly the fact that one of the sort of framing devices that Everett uses is that James is writing his narrative, writing his memoir, his autobiography in a book that also includes these racist minstrel songs, right? And so uh, Everett is constantly drawing our attention to the actual material of writing, right? The kinds of paper, the kinds of books, the kinds of pens and pencils, right? Like the stuff you need, not necessarily the techniques or the education or the literacies, drawing our attention to those things as well, but also just the stuff, right? How does one create any kind of record of one's experience under these conditions, right? And I think the use of minstrelsy is in some ways to draw our attention to sometimes a certain kind of self-immolation, sacrifice has to be made in order to survive in these conditions and also in order to gain access to the tools of recording and amplifying one's experience. Right. And we can think about minstrelsy in exactly that way, right? That though minstrelsy was, clearly invented by white people for the purpose of demeaning Black people, there are also, many recorded instances of Black people gaining a sort of uh, emancipation, right? uh, access to certain degree of wealth and pay for their labor and appreciation of their talents, right? Through joining in, becoming part of this tradition that was invented to dehumanize it, right? So there's this sort of complicated history to minstrelsy that we see certainly in works by Eric Lott and elsewhere, that I think Everett is also drawing our attention to, and is also present, is also very much present in Twain's work, though not as explicitly. Twain was a huge fan of minstrel theater in his youth and remembered that throughout his life and called upon it. And I definitely think one of the things that is happening in that final section, one of the things that is happening in those last chapters is we are we are seeing Jim placed in a kind of minstrel position. And and so I thought I found it, both very crafty, but also very apt that Everett would draw our attention to the way minstrel theater operates during this period in American history.
Yeah. This just made me think of, I don't know why I didn't think of it till now, but you see the same thing with Sitting Bull joining Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show. This sort of reappropriation of these
Yeah.
tools. Sally here asks, and I think that based on my memory of the novel, I think this isn't technically a spoiler if we're being precise. I'm wondering why you think Everett moved the story forward in time a few decades. I wonder how he might have ended the story if the war didn't arrive.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's an excellent question. It was definitely one of the things that really surprised me when I was reading. Um, and I mean, I think one way to answer that question is, a very Twain scholar way to answer that question is that the war is never talked about in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, but it is ever present in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, right? That we have a novel that's set 20 years before the Civil War and a novel that's published 20 years after the end of the Civil War, right? And so there's this kind of symmetry that is implied from the moment you open the book up, right? That we are looking back in time, and in the immediate middle between us and what we're looking at is this massive historical event, right? That obviously would have had influence on all of the characters and certainly had influence on Twain himself, right? And I think you know Twain's decision to write Huckleberry Finn has to be considered in some ways motivated by that central question. Why do you want to write a book about this circumstance and about the injustices of enslavement when enslavement no longer exists, right? When the Civil War happened, right? Isn't this problem already solved, right? And I think that what I described in my earlier remarks is that Twain has to come to terms himself with the fact that this horrible traumatic thing happened to him and to everybody he knew. And yet, the thing that it was supposed to resolve has not been resolved. And, and that's the motive to write the book in the first place. So the Civil War is a ghost, maybe in all of Twain's work, but certainly in Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Everett makes it literal.
We have a question here, a good one that I'm excited to hear your take on. In what ways might Everett's Jim and Twain's Jim have more in common than meets the eye? While Everett's Jim is literate and bi-dialectical and Twain's is not, are there more parallels than differences?
I see who's asking that
Yeah.
question. So, um, and Shelley, who we may end up talking about her work a little bit later as well. And I think it's important. I want to just say first that Shelley is one of the people who has changed Twain studies dramatically in the last 30 years. And I don't think a book like James is possible without her work and the work of several scholars from her generation that really took a look at what Twain's sort of critical reputation had become in the 20th century, and then took a look at the historical record and said these two things do not belong together, right? And started making us look at Twain and at Huckleberry Finn and in a whole new light. And certainly, my career as a Twain scholar could not exist without Shelley's work. And I really think a book like James doesn't exist without Shelley's work. So let me just give that little preface before saying that, yeah, I do think that there are ways to reconcile Twain's Jim and Everett's James. I don't think that Twain's characterization of Jim is always as flat and convenient and demeaning as it is sometimes made out to be. And I think Everett even draws attention to this, during the conversation last week, is that two things, right? One is that we're looking at this from the perspective of 140 years later, and of course, the kind of achievement of creating a character like Jim seems less remarkable than it did. But certainly, there was no character quite like Jim written in a fictional text in a popular novel by a white author at that point, right? And also, we are only seeing Jim. We can only see Jim through Huck's eyes, right? Which means we are inevitably going to be limited to Huck's perspective. And if Huck gives Jim too much space, right? Especially in the early parts of the novel, right? Then the kind of the verisimilitude, right, of their relationship and of Huck's very slow coming to terms with the society around him would be lost. Right? But I do think Twain often hints at things that are going on with Jim that even Huck doesn't quite see, but he acknowledges enough for the reader to start to imagine, right? To start to see, elements of Jim's emotional life, his intellectual life, his relationship to family, and also his sort of really his awareness of the world around him, right? That he understands. I'll make just one example, right? Like he understands what Cairo means in the sort of geopolitical contexts of this moment in a way that Huck clearly does not, right? But that we as readers can, right? And so there are definitely hints that Twain gives us that we are dealing with a much more intelligent and emotionally rich and dynamic character than even Huck realizes, right? But he can only do so much, right? Given the limitations of a first person narrator who is unreliable, who is young, who is brought up in a racist society, so on and so forth.
So I think this might be the moment. If you haven't finished the book, this is your time to depart if you don't want to be spoiled. I would say if you think, oh, it can't be that bad, don't spoil yourself. This will be viewable tomorrow or whenever you have finished the book and want to see the end of it. And as I also dropped in the chat, we do have signed copies of James that are available from the museum store. So leave now or forever hold your peace. And I think we've got some comments here in the Q&A. One, Stephanie sort of arguing that the James is lacking the tender moments between Jim and Huck that you see in Twain. I have to say, I think a lot of us at the museum, I have never thought this book actually made me remember, like, oh, Tom is just a dumb kid too. Like, I really had an awareness of them as children
Mhm.
in this book. You think of Huck as a kid, and then you think of Huck as something else in the last minute. So I don't know if there's anything you want to say about the last 12 chapters of this book before we take questions.
Well, so I am still trying to work out my interpretation of these chapters, and I've had lots of conversations with other scholars, both Twain scholars and Black Studies scholars. I think a lot of us are still sort of forming our interpretations of the decisions that Everett makes here. Um, I will say the big twist, and so here's the spoiler. The decision to literally make James Huck's father, right, was telegraphed to me, many, many, many chapters earlier, right? It was very evident to me that if Everett was not going to go the whole way and make literal that uh what is a kind of metaphorical bond in Twain's novel, he was certainly going to keep holding that possibility up to us in more and more literal ways. And there is a kind of critical tradition that that made me more likely to suspect this. A critical tradition that clearly includes Shelley's book, Was Huck Black, right? Which I think is important to note, as Everett did in his talk last week, right? That what Shelley is doing in that book is suggesting that Huck's voice is informed by Black speech and Black speakers and a tradition of Black oratory that Twain was appropriating throughout the novel, and for Huck as well as for the Black characters, right? But there have been many instances of then taking that kind of metaphorical question and formal device and making it literal, including a novel from a few years ago, which is in Pap Finn's perspective, that presumes that Huck's mother was Black, right? Not that Jim was Huck's father, but rather that Huck's mother was Black. And so this sort of question about Huck's racial identity, whether a phenotypical identity or a cultural identity, is one that has circulated in Twain studies and Twain interpretation for 25, 30 years now, right? And so it was not necessarily shocking to me that what I think many people experienced as a major twist did not feel that way to me. But what I did find very interesting about it, and this very directly builds on what Shelley's actual argument is, right, is that there is this disconnect between James and Huck based even after they have established the familial bond, and even after they have established a shared racial identity, there is a disconnect between them based purely on culture and especially language, right? That in order for Huck to become, right, Jim's son, right, it's not just a matter of knowing, right, that he's Jim's son. It's not just a matter of embracing and saying, I am going to define myself as black, right? He has to have lived this experience, and he has to particularly have been trained as James does, right? That he's training these children in Hannibal to know the codes of blackness. And and Huck doesn't have any of that training, and therefore can't really become Jim's son in the way that maybe he would like to be, because Jim will always feel this cultural and linguistic divide, right? And I think that, that part of the twist is really powerful and very much in keeping with the broader themes of the novel. And again, not just of James, but also of Twain's novel.
Yeah, and I'm gonna, sorry, take moderator's privilege and ask you to speak, if only because I saw this in a reader's guide for the book. I saw James framed as sort of, this is a really important discussion of the violence and trauma sort of heaped on enslaved women.
Hmm.
And we've had some conversations at the
Yeah.
museum about particularly Sammy and the sort of relative depths of the male and female characters in the book. And I wonder if you could speak a little to that.
Yeah. So I have gone a lot of different directions thinking about this in the last few months. And again, spoiler, but you know, the the novel changes to a revenge plot in those final chapters, and it is provoked most directly by James witnessing the rape of an enslaved woman by an overseer. Yep. And so we have that moment, which changes James in some ways. I mean, I think there's lots of suggestions that he was headed in this direction maybe anyway, right? But that is the kind of the moment, the final straw, right? That that turns him murderous, right? And he goes seeking revenge regardless of the cost, following the witnessing of the sexual violence, right? And the place that he goes, right, is emblematic of that sexual violence, right? He goes to seek his wife and daughter, who have been sold to a breeding plantation, right? And so, though I think very grateful for this, Everett withholds showing the kind of extremes of what might have taken place in that space. He of course invites us to imagine it in all of its horror, right? And we see the effect that that imagination is having upon James, right? We experience the effect that that imagination is having on James, right? And so we have the witnessing, the act of rape and sexual violence, and then we have the imagining and the anticipation and the seeking out, right, of this site of extreme sexual violence, right? And all of this would seem to suggest, at least to some degree, that Everett is engaged in kind of scenes of subjection, right? That a way of depicting black life only through the most horrible things that would be associated with enslavement and discrimination and racialized violence, right? Um, and so, the final 12 chapters of the novel in particular, right, move in that direction. Now, we get catharsis over the course of that, right? We get to see him murder the rapist. We get to see him, kill the owner of the plantation, and we get to see him escape with his family, right? And so there, it isn't defined solely by the scenes of subjection, but the scenes of subjection are what motivate and move the plot forward in that final section. And it is all, right, revolves around sexualized violence, despite the fact that, as is the case in Twain's novel, there aren't any very dynamic woman characters, right? And I do think that's it's a justifiable criticism of both novels. Of course, right? There are also some rationales for it. There's some historical rationales, some ways in which James, sort of explains, right, the choices he makes and the desire to protect his family and the difficulty of making those choices, the horrible difficulty that those choices are placed upon him under the conditions of enslavement. Okay? But yeah, I think this is a very powerful question, and I think the question that I am asking in return and have been trying to work through is, like, does Everett want us to experience that despite the catharsis he gives us? Does he want to experience us to experience that in a sort of squeamish, queasy, cringy way, right? That it, the kind of uh the hyperbolicness of the scenes of subjection, much as there is a kind of hyperbolicness to the romance in Twain's conclusion, right? It suggests that, like, we are being asked, do you like this? Do you want this? Right? And I think most of us, as it's happening, are likely to say no, right? But I think the other thing it's saying, well, isn't this all around you, right? Isn't this in every depiction of blackness on television and in film and in popular culture, right? These scenes of subjection, this kind of fantasy of violent black sexuality and revenge, isn't this something that you see everywhere, right? It could almost be a kind of 19th century version of the my pathology narrative in Erasure, right? Another one of Everett's novels, right? And so that's been the thing I've sort of been grappling with, and when I go back to reread, I'm definitely going to be thinking about, like, technically, how does Everett lead us to, right? He is certainly, I think, very clearly invoking particular scenes, particularly from film, in this final section. And if we start to kind of, catalog the kinds of filmic appropriations that he's making, does that reveal whether this is a kind of sincere or satirical representation of scenes of subjection?
Yeah, I think the think pieces and journal articles to come out about, you brought up Tarantino earlier, and I'm glad you used the word fantasy, and also sort of 1970s pulpy. I mean, there's it's
Blaxploitation, yeah,
blaxploitation, exactly. It's
yeah.
it's a rich text, to coin a phrase. Um, this has been a really wonderful conversation. I have lent the book to somebody, and I'd like to ask them, if you're not reading it, can I please have it back again? Because I'd like to read it again. I so appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us, especially kind of pegging them to Everett's visit last week. And I thank so many of our kind of distant and local patrons for joining us tonight. This was really wonderful. I'm going to drop in the chat. I put in the link to James. Check out our YouTube channel that will have everything, as well as next, let me make sure I have the date right, June 20th. Um, another minor conversation about Twain and Lincoln, with Jason Silverman. So thank you again, Matt. This has been really wonderful, and thank you to everybody who joined us tonight. Keep reading and keep thinking, and have a great evening.
Thank you, everybody.